Why Buddhism says your mind is your worst enemy. The Buddha's powerful lesson on mindfulness. In the unfolding journey of life, we often encounter a persistent companion, the mind. It is a companion, yes, but one that can be both a guide and a silent adversary, always with us, yet rarely recognized for its true nature. The mind is a fascinating entity, a vast and complex network of thoughts, memories, and emotions that never ceases to churn. It serves us in many ways, helping us plan, make decisions, and navigate the world. Yet it is also the subtle enemy that ensnares us in the web of its ceaseless chatter, its illusory fears, and its self-imposed limitations. It draws us into past regrets, pulls us into future anxieties, and clouds our judgment when we need clarity the most. Every single day, the mind invites us to revisit moments long gone, those little missteps or perceived slights that no longer exist outside of our memories. It spins tales of what may lie ahead, crafting stories filled with what-ifs and maybes, scenarios that often never come to fruition. It weaves doubt into the very fabric of our being, questioning our worth, our choices, and our purpose, especially in moments when we need the calmest mind to see things clearly. This constant mental noise, this inner voice that never seems to stop talking, is so familiar that we begin to mistake it for our true self. It becomes a trusted friend, whispering in our ear, telling us who we are, what we need, and what we fear. But here lies the great paradox. What if that voice, which we follow so unquestioningly, is not who we truly are? What if it is a reflection, not of our true nature, but of the countless layers of conditioning, habit, and illusion we have accumulated over the years? The Buddha, in his infinite wisdom, understood this fundamental aspect of human existence. He saw that the mind, left unchecked, can be a trap, a prison of our own making, built from the thoughts, memories, and emotions we cling to. And just as a prisoner is unaware of the bars that hold them, we too are often unaware of how tightly we are bound by the very mind we trust. The teachings of the Buddha offer us a path out of this mental labyrinth. He taught us to recognize that the mind is not who we are, that we are not the sum of our thoughts or the stories we tell ourselves. We are the awareness that observes these thoughts, the still presence beneath the turbulence. And in this recognition, in this shift from identification with the mind to simply witnessing its movements, lies the key to freedom. To see this clearly is the first step toward liberation, a liberation that does not require silencing the mind, but understanding it. The mind will always be there, a constant companion in our journey, but it no longer needs to be our enemy. It can be a tool for wisdom, a means of awakening, if we only learn to observe it with the eyes of compassion, with the understanding that beneath all its noise, there is peace waiting to be uncovered. In this space of awareness, we begin to experience the timeless truth of the Buddha's teachings, that our true nature is not bound by the mind's illusions, but is the boundless, compassionate presence that is always here, always now. It is through this awareness, this awakening to the present moment, that we come to understand the deepest nature of our being, and in that understanding, we find the peace and freedom that we have always sought. Chapter 1: The Mind, a Restless Prisoner. The mind, as the Buddha so profoundly described, is like a fish cast from water onto dry land. It thrashes, it trembles, desperately searching for something solid to cling to, but it can find no rest. It is a restless prisoner, caught in a cycle of endless striving, caught between past regrets and future anxieties, forever flickering in uncertainty. And yet, here is the most astonishing thing. Most of us live our lives under the illusion that we are the ones in control. We assume that the thoughts that arise in our minds are reflections of our true self, that these thoughts are guides to our reality. But the Buddha's teachings offer a profound insight that cuts through this illusion. Much of what we think arises automatically, propelled by mental habits, fears, insecurities, and experiences long past. These patterns govern us in ways we rarely recognize, leading us to believe that we are the ones in charge when, in fact, we are prisoners to the very thoughts we identify with. I once spoke with a dear friend, a woman with a heart full of kindness and a spirit constantly giving. She shared with me an experience many of us know all too well. The moment she awakens in the morning, before her feet even touch the ground, her mind is already racing. She told me how her mind begins by dragging her into a whirlwind of thoughts. It pulls her back to a comment she made the day before, a small slip of the tongue that no one else likely even remembered, yet her mind replays it over and over, as if endlessly trying to rewrite the past. Then, without warning, her mind pivots to the day ahead, imagining a cascade of challenges, deadlines, meetings, and fears of failing to live up to expectations. The day has not even begun, and already her mind has created a storm of imagined worries and regrets. This experience is not unique to my friend. It is something we all experience, often without even realizing it. The mind, in its restlessness, steals our peace before we even set foot in the world. How often do we wake in the morning, and before we can fully open our eyes, we are already immersed in the chaotic currents of our thoughts. We may not yet have left the comfort of our bed, but our minds have already carried us through a day full of imagined problems and fears. It's as if we are prisoners to a reality our minds have created, one that may not even exist outside of our thoughts. And herein lies the profound wisdom of the Buddha. His teachings invite us to step outside this prison, to awaken to the truth that we are not our thoughts. We are the ones who observe the thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. This distinction, so simple yet so powerful, is the key to breaking free from the mind's endless cycle of confusion and suffering. We are not the prisoners, but the ones who hold the key to the cell door, waiting for us to realize that it was always within our grasp. But how do we begin to see this truth? How do we start to recognize that we are not the prisoner, but the one who can watch from a place of peace and clarity? The first step is awareness, a simple yet profound awareness that allows us to notice when our minds begin to wander, when it drags us into the past or projects us into the future. This awareness is like a light in the darkness, illuminating the patterns that have controlled us for so long. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from our attachment to our thoughts and emotions, our identification with them as being who we are. When we cling to these thoughts, we give them power over us, and they continue to shape our reality in ways that keep us bound. By simply observing our thoughts without identifying with them, we begin to loosen their grip. We start to see that thoughts are like clouds. They come and go, they may be dark or light, but they are not permanent. They are not who we are. One of the most profound practices in Buddhism is mindfulness, the practice of being present and aware in each moment without attachment or judgment. When we practice mindfulness, we create a space between ourselves and our thoughts. We begin to see the thoughts for what they truly are, fleeting mental events that arise and fade like waves on the surface of the ocean. In this space, we find freedom. The mind, no longer identified with, loses its power to control us. We learn that we are not bound by the restless churning of thoughts, but that beneath this turbulence there is stillness, there is peace. This is the essence of the Buddha's teaching. The mind, in all its restlessness, is not our true self. It is simply a tool, a companion that we can learn to observe rather than be consumed by. As we deepen our practice, we discover that we do not need to silence the mind in order to find peace. Peace arises when we stop fighting the mind and simply allow it to be, watching it without judgment, without attachment. In this space of awareness, we become free. We begin to see that we are not the prisoner. We are the one who has always been free, waiting for the moment to step out of the illusion. By embracing this understanding, we reclaim our power. We stop being swept away by the storm of thoughts and emotions, and instead, we stand firm in the calm center of our being. The mind may continue to move, but we no longer believe every thought that comes to us. We see the thoughts for what they are, temporary, fleeting, and without true substance. And in this recognition, we find the freedom the Buddha spoke of, the freedom to live with clarity, with compassion, and with an open heart. Chapter 2: The Mind's Distortion of Reality. The mind is not a passive observer of the world around us. It actively shapes and distorts the reality we perceive. It does not merely reflect the events that happen, it interprets them through the lens of our past experiences, our fears, and our desires. In this way, the mind becomes both a creator and a distorting filter of our personal reality. I have seen this play out time and time again, not only in others, but in my own life as well. The Buddha understood this fundamental aspect of the human experience, that while two people may witness the same event, their minds will filter and interpret it in entirely different ways. One person might feel burdened by the weight of past mistakes, while another may look to the future with anxiety, fearing what is yet to come. Consider this simple scenario. You are walking down the street and wave to a friend as they pass by, but they don't wave back. The mind, ever quick to interpret, immediately begins weaving a story. Maybe they're angry with me, it whispers. What did I do wrong? In an instant, the mind builds a narrative based on its own fears and insecurities. A story where you are the central character, perhaps one who has caused offense or failed in some way. But the truth might be far simpler than the story your mind has created. Perhaps your friend didn't see you at all, lost in their own thoughts or distracted by something in the moment. Yet in that fleeting moment, the mind has already created an entire emotional drama, wrapping you up in a web of doubt and discomfort. This is how the mind operates, constantly spinning stories that pull us into emotional turmoil. It doesn't just passively observe, it actively engages, shaping how we experience our lives. It builds walls of fear, constructs stories of regret, and projects fantasies of what the future might hold. These mental stories, often rooted in misunderstanding or projection, cause us to suffer unnecessarily. The Buddha taught that all suffering arises from craving and attachment, but it is important to understand that much of this suffering is born not from the external world, but from the narratives our minds create about it. These stories, shaped by our attachments, our fears, and our desires, cloud our judgment and prevent us from seeing things clearly. The mind distorts our reality because it cannot help but filter everything through its own conditioned patterns. These patterns, developed over years of living, accumulate like dust on a mirror, obscuring our true perception of the world. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. How many times has your mind distorted the truth of a situation, leading you to feel hurt, misunderstood, or frustrated? How many times have you misinterpreted the actions or words of others, only to find later that your fears were unfounded? This distortion of reality is not a flaw in our character. It is simply the nature of the mind when it is allowed to function without mindfulness or awareness. The Buddha's wisdom calls us to recognize these patterns and to begin to see them for what they are, mental fabrications. The mind's tendency to create stories is not inherently bad, it is part of being human. However, it is only through mindfulness, through becoming aware of these stories as they arise, that we can begin to disarm their power over us. We can learn to notice when the mind is spinning tales that do not reflect the true nature of reality. And when we see these stories for what they are, fleeting thoughts rather than absolute truths, we can begin to release the attachment we have to them. In his teachings, the Buddha emphasized the importance of seeing things as they truly are. This clarity comes not from controlling the mind or forcing it to stop creating stories, but from recognizing that the stories are just that, stories. They are not facts, they are not reality, and when we cease identifying with them, we free ourselves from the suffering they create. The mind's distortion is powerful, but it is not invincible. In the space of awareness, we begin to see the world as it truly is, without the layers of fear and attachment that cloud our perception. This practice of awareness is the heart of mindfulness. It is the ability to observe the mind without becoming entangled in its narratives. When we cultivate this awareness, we begin to experience life as it is, not as the mind wants us to perceive it. We start to see that the external world is often not the source of our suffering. It is the way we relate to it, the stories we create in our minds about it, that causes us distress. The Buddha often spoke of the mind as being like a pond. When the water is stirred up, it becomes muddy and unclear. But when we let the water settle, the clarity of the pond is restored. In the same way, when we stop reacting to our thoughts and stories, when we simply allow them to arise and pass away without attachment, the mind becomes still. In that stillness, we see clearly. The distortion falls away, and we begin to perceive the truth of the moment, free from the filters of our past and our fears. The key to overcoming the mind's distortion of reality is not to fight against it or to suppress it, but to become aware of it. It is to recognize the moment the mind begins to spin a tale, and instead of believing in it, to gently step back and ask, is this true? Do I know this for certain? By questioning our thoughts, we begin to loosen their grip on us. And in that loosening, we find the freedom to experience the world as it truly is, unclouded by the stories the mind wants to tell. In this way, the Buddha's teachings offer us a path to liberation, a path that leads us to see the world with clarity, free from the distortions of the mind's endless chatter. Chapter 3: Awareness, the Key to Liberation. In the stillness of mindfulness, we find the key to our liberation. The moment we cease to battle with our thoughts, when we step back and begin to observe them with awareness, a shift occurs. It's as if we open a door to a space that was always there, just waiting for us to notice. This space is freedom. The Buddha, with his profound wisdom, pointed out that the suffering we experience does not arise from external circumstances, but from our attachment to our thoughts. When we stop identifying with them, when we stop fighting against them, we allow ourselves the freedom to simply be. It is like watching clouds float lazily across the sky, each one unique yet impermanent, moving freely without clinging to anything. Thoughts, much like those clouds, come and go, but they do not define us. They are fleeting, temporary, and without substance. The challenge comes when we grasp at them, when we mistake them for truth and identity, and thus become trapped in a cycle of mental entanglement. Imagine, if you will, a bird caught inside a cage woven from its own feathers. It flaps its wings, it struggles, it searches for a way out, yet it cannot see that the very bars that confine it are the result of its own actions. The bird, so focused on escape, fails to realize that it is the one who has built its own prison. In this same way, the mind, caught in its endless patterns of thought, struggles against its own mental constructs, unaware that it is the one that has created the bars of its own cage. The mind, when left unchecked, entangles us in its constant noise, in its stories, in its worries, in its judgments. It is like a prisoner, not realizing that the door is already open, that the path to freedom is always available, if only we stop believing the illusion that we are trapped. The Buddha's teaching on mindfulness is the antidote to this suffering. Mindfulness invites us to observe our thoughts, to become aware of them without judgment or attachment. The very act of observation creates a space between ourselves and the thoughts that arise. This space is where freedom lies. When we watch our thoughts without reacting, without becoming entangled in them, the grip of the mind begins to loosen. We no longer identify with every thought that enters our mind, and in that detachment, we discover the stillness that has always been present beneath the noise. Take a moment to reflect. How often do you allow yourself to be swept away by your thoughts? How many times have you found yourself lost in a stream of worry, regret, or anger, as though those thoughts define who you are? We are all guilty of becoming lost in our mental landscape, but here's the profound truth. The moment we become aware of the mind's patterns, we stop identifying with them. We see them for what they are. Transient, impermanent, and without real substance. They are like the passing clouds, here for a moment, then gone the next. The mind is not our enemy, but our ally in awakening. It is through awareness that we begin to recognize the truth of the mind's nature. The more we cultivate mindfulness, the more we understand the impermanent nature of our thoughts. We see that they come and go like waves in the ocean. And when we stop trying to control or hold onto them, we can ride those waves with ease and grace. The Buddha often compared the mind to a restless ocean, constantly stirred by the winds of desire, fear, and attachment. But beneath that surface, there is always a depth of stillness. In that depth, peace resides, and it is through mindfulness that we dive into that stillness, recognizing it as our true nature, a nature that is always calm and undisturbed, regardless of the storm above. As we practice mindfulness, we begin to loosen the mental knots that bind us. The stories that once defined us, the narrative of I am this or I am that, begin to dissolve. We no longer hold tightly to the idea that we are the sum of our thoughts. We become the observer, the witness to the ever-changing flow of thoughts. And in that witnessing, we experience a freedom that is profound and transformative. The moment we stop grasping at our thoughts, we discover that there is a space, a quiet, open space that was always available to us. It is the space of awareness, the space of liberation. In this space, we experience peace. Not the peace that comes from a life without challenges, but the peace that arises when we stop clinging to our thoughts, when we stop reacting to every story the mind tells. It is the peace of knowing that we are not our thoughts, but the awareness that observes them. And in that awareness, we find the freedom to live fully, to engage with the world without being bound by the mind's illusions. In this practice of awareness, the mind's grip loosens and we are able to see clearly. The thought patterns that once held us in their grip no longer have power over us. We are no longer prisoners of the mind. We are the one who watches the mind, the one who understands its patterns, and in that understanding, we are free. This is the heart of the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness, not to fight against the mind, but to understand it. And in that understanding, we uncover the peace that lies beneath. It is not a peace that depends on circumstances, but a peace that arises from within. It is the peace of awareness, the awareness that we are not defined by our thoughts, but by the presence that observes them. And in that presence, we are free to live with love, compassion, and wisdom. Chapter 4: The Buddha's Teaching on Freedom from the Mind. The Buddha's teachings on mindfulness offer us a path to navigate the endless storm of thoughts that often governs our lives. This storm, composed of worries, fears, desires, and regrets, can feel all-encompassing, as though it is the very fabric of our existence. Yet in the heart of the Buddha's wisdom, we find an invitation to shift how we relate to this mental turmoil. He did not teach us to fight our thoughts, nor did he ask us to suppress or avoid them. Instead, he called us to transform our relationship with them, to see them for what they truly are, transient mental events, not permanent realities, and certainly not reflections of who we are. Through mindfulness, we learn that the mind is not an enemy to be conquered, but a tool to be understood. We do not need to escape from thought. We need to cease being dragged into the current of every passing thought. Much like a leaf caught in a stream, our minds often race from one thought to the next, without pause, without awareness. But when we practice mindfulness, we create a space between us and those thoughts. This space is where true freedom lies. The Buddha's simple but profound teaching, "Thoughts are not you," cuts to the core of this freedom. When we begin to observe our thoughts, we realize that they come and go, often without our conscious control. They arise from our past experiences, our desires, and our conditioning, but they do not define us. They are simply mental phenomena, fleeting and impermanent. They do not determine our worth, our truth, or our path in life. When we stop identifying with them, when we stop clinging to them as if they are our reality, we free ourselves from their power. Imagine for a moment standing by a busy road, watching the cars rush by. The noise, the speed, the movement all create a sense of chaos, but you remain unaffected. You observe the traffic with detachment, aware of its presence, yet not drawn into it. This is what mindfulness teaches us to do with our thoughts. We observe them without becoming swept away by them. We stop reacting to each thought, each mental impulse, as though it were the truth of who we are. Instead, we learn to witness the mind with openness and curiosity, understanding that thoughts are like the traffic. They are there, but they are not us. This shift in perception, from being lost in thought to witnessing thought, is where true freedom emerges. It is the moment when we no longer allow our thoughts to define us, when we stop identifying with every fleeting notion that enters the mind. It is the moment when we realize that we do not need to cling to our thoughts, to chase after them, or to make them into something they are not. This is the heart of mindfulness, the awareness that we are the observer, not the thought itself. In this space of observation, we find clarity. The noise of the mind, which once felt so overwhelming, begins to quiet. We begin to see our thoughts clearly, without the distortion of fear, attachment, or desire. We see that the mind's stories, the ones that have caused us so much suffering, are just that, stories. They are not the truth. They do not have to shape our experience of reality. When we step back and witness them, we break free from the cycle of identifying with every thought and every emotional reaction. In the Buddha's teachings, this space of mindfulness is not simply an absence of thought or a withdrawal from life. It is an active, present awareness, a calm and clear presence that exists even amid the storm of thoughts. It is not about stopping the mind from thinking, but about changing how we relate to those thoughts. When we cultivate this awareness, we can begin to live with more peace, more clarity, and more compassion. As we practice mindfulness, we begin to recognize the patterns of thought that pull us into suffering. We see how the mind, when left unchecked, creates unnecessary suffering by attaching to past regrets or future fears. But in the space of observation, we learn to let go. We learn to release the stories the mind creates, knowing that they do not serve us. We stop taking every thought so seriously, and we begin to live with a lighter heart. The Buddha's path to freedom is not about silencing the mind, but about understanding it. It is about recognizing that the mind's thoughts are not the enemy, they are simply passing phenomena. When we learn to observe our thoughts with mindfulness, we stop being controlled by them, and in that space of observation, we discover the peace that has always been there, beneath the noise of the mind. In that peace, we find true freedom. Chapter 5: The Path to Mastery, the Practice of Non-Attachment. True peace, as the Buddha taught, does not come from controlling the mind, but from releasing our attachment to it. This distinction may seem subtle at first, but it holds profound implications for our daily lives. In a world that teaches us to grasp tightly to our thoughts, emotions, and desires, the Buddha's message is radical. To achieve genuine peace, we must learn to let go, not to hold on. The Buddha illustrated this truth with a simple but powerful story. One day, a man came to him, full of anger, trying to provoke the Buddha. The man expected a reaction, perhaps anger or a sharp response. Yet the Buddha remained calm, unmoved by the man's verbal attacks. When the man asked why he did not react, the Buddha replied with a question: "If someone offers you a gift, but you refuse to accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man, upon hearing this, understood the Buddha's point. Anger, like a gift, only remains with the person who accepts it. In the Buddha's words, the anger would not have affected him unless he had chosen to hold on to it. This story reveals the essence of non-attachment. It shows us that our suffering does not arise from the external world, but from our reaction to it. The world around us is full of situations, interactions, and emotions, but our attachment to them, the belief that we must react, hold on to, or control them, keeps us trapped. The mind is like a wild animal that is always searching for something to latch onto, whether it be a thought, a feeling, or a belief. But when we grasp onto these mental objects, we are not free, we are bound by them. Our suffering is the result of this grip, this attachment. In our daily lives, we often think that strength lies in holding on to our pride, our opinions, our sense of self, or our need to be right. We live in a world where being steadfast, firm, and unyielding is often celebrated. But the Buddha's wisdom points to a different kind of strength, one that arises from letting go. True strength is not about clinging to control, but about releasing it. When we cling to the past, we suffer the weight of old memories, old wounds, and regrets. When we cling to the future, we live in a constant state of anxiety, fear, or anticipation. And when we cling to the idea of who we think we should be, we build a false identity, one that keeps us in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. Non-attachment does not mean that we abandon our responsibilities or our relationships, nor does it mean that we forget our past or cease to plan for the future. Rather, non-attachment means that we release the need to control these things. We learn to engage with life fully and deeply, without clinging to the outcomes or the need to define ourselves by them. Non-attachment is the freedom to experience life as it is, without trying to force it into a box of our expectations. It is the realization that we do not need to control every aspect of our existence to find peace and contentment. When we practice non-attachment, we stop allowing our thoughts and emotions to dictate our actions. We stop letting the mind lead us on a never-ending chase for validation, approval, and control. Instead, we begin to live with an open heart, fully present to the moment, without the need to grasp, to possess, or to force things to happen. We learn to observe our thoughts and feelings without getting entangled in them, to notice when we are clinging to something and gently release it. This is where the power of mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness is not just about being present, it is about being present without attachment. It is the ability to be aware of what is happening in the moment without getting swept away by it. Whether it's a difficult emotion, an uncomfortable situation, or a fleeting thought, mindfulness teaches us to observe without judgment, to let go without resistance. This practice allows us to experience life with greater clarity and peace, for we no longer live at the mercy of our attachments. Letting go does not mean forgetting or resigning ourselves to apathy. It means releasing the control that the mind has over us, stepping out of the cycle of clinging and aversion. We begin to free ourselves from the idea that we need things to be a certain way in order to be happy. We no longer feel the need to prove ourselves, to hold on to our grudges, or to carry the weight of our past mistakes. By letting go of the mind's attachments, we open ourselves to the truth of the present moment, and in that truth, we find peace. The practice of non-attachment is an ongoing journey. It requires patience, compassion, and awareness. It is not something that can be mastered overnight, but as we continue to let go of the things that bind us, we begin to experience greater freedom and peace. We learn to see our thoughts for what they are, temporary, fleeting, and ultimately not who we are. And in that seeing, we find our true strength, not in holding on, but in letting go. The Buddha's teaching on non-attachment invites us to live without the need to possess, to control, or to cling. It shows us that peace is not found in the external world, but in the space we create by releasing the mind's grasp. When we let go, we are not losing anything of value. we are gaining the freedom to live authentically, without the weight of attachment to false identities or unfulfilled desires. True mastery is the ability to release the hold the mind has on us and to live fully in the present, unburdened by the need to control or define our experiences. In that freedom, we find the deep peace the Buddha promised. Chapter 6: Finding Peace in the Present. In the ebb and flow of our daily lives, it is so easy to become ensnared by the thoughts of what has been or what might be. We dwell on past mistakes, regrets, and failures, replaying them over and over in our minds. Or we succumb to the anxiety of a future that is uncertain and out of our control. But in all this mental noise, the Buddha's teachings offer us a clear and gentle path back to peace. Peace is found in the present moment. This is a profound truth, one that can radically change our experience of life. So often, we chase after peace, thinking that it is something to be achieved in the future or something to be controlled and forced into being. But the Buddha's wisdom shows us that peace is not something to be created, it is something to be recognized. It is not found by controlling the mind, but by no longer being controlled by it. When we free ourselves from the grip of attachment to our thoughts, whether they are memories of the past or fears of the future, we begin to uncover a quiet strength that has always been there, waiting for us to notice. This strength is a steady awareness, one that remains unshaken by the chaos of the mind. It is the awareness that recognizes thoughts for what they truly are, passing clouds in the sky of our consciousness. They come and go, but they do not define us. When we stop clinging to these thoughts, when we stop identifying with them as though they are who we are, we discover a peace that exists beyond them. Through the practice of mindfulness, we come to understand that true freedom is not about eliminating thoughts or controlling the mind. It is about releasing the mental patterns that bind us, letting go of the stories and beliefs we have held for so long. As we begin to observe our thoughts with detachment, we start to experience life more fully, more clearly. The past no longer holds us in its grip, and the future no longer overwhelms us with its uncertainties. We are free to rest in the present, in the peace that is our true nature. This practice of mindfulness is both simple and profound. It invites us to be fully present in each moment without judgment or attachment. It teaches us to observe our thoughts, our emotions, and our experiences without getting lost in them. And in this space of observation, we find not just peace, but liberation, a liberation from the constant chatter of the mind, from the weight of our attachments, and from the belief that we need anything outside of this moment to be at peace. True peace does not come from controlling life or the mind, it comes from letting go of the illusion that we need to control at all. When we release this illusion, we find that peace was always there, waiting for us in the present moment. It is the peace of simply being, of allowing ourselves to experience life as it is, without the need to cling or push away. It is the peace of recognizing that we are not our thoughts, but the awareness behind them. As we walk this path of mindfulness, we begin to experience life with a new clarity. The suffering that once seemed so inevitable begins to dissolve as we release our attachment to it. In its place, we discover a deep, abiding peace, one that is not dependent on external circumstances, but is rooted in the ever-present reality of the present moment. The Buddha's teachings offer us a simple, yet profound invitation. To rest in the present, to let go of the stories the mind tells, and to discover the peace that has always been there. It is in this space of letting go, of mindfulness, that we find the freedom to live fully and freely. True peace is not something to chase, it is something to recognize, something to uncover in the stillness of our own being. And when we do, we are not just free from the mind, we are free to live with love, compassion, and wisdom.